Chapter 8 Living Creatively with Inner Earth Changes. Where is the real cutting edge for these times of change? Technological advancements, changing rules for women, shifts in the balance of political power. These and countless other factors are playing crucial roles. But Case's Millennium Prophecies point to something else. The changes to take place within each individual, the inner levels are where people experience and deal with cultural and physical transformations. That's the cutting edge, and it's far more significant than anything else, including earthquakes. According to these prophecies, the outer will largely be shaped by the inner. In the way people collectively deal with the inner millennium shift, the outer forms will be created for us to experience. In the previous chapter, we examined Case's philosophy that God is dynamic and fosters change. We also identified an opportunity that each of us can accept when the world around us is being transformed. The chance to become a co-creator, to be sensitive to an emerging new paradigm and embrace it. In this chapter, we will venture farther in that direction and try to answer the question, exactly how can we begin to prepare ourselves right now to become people who will co-create a new world? In other words, what's the next step for those willing to make a paradigm shift? There are, in fact, disciplines to prepare ourselves for the work of building a new world, exercises that Case mentioned time and again to people interested in preparing themselves for the future. A trio of disciplines makes up the Case formula for those who want to help build the kind of world in the next millennium that he envisioned. First, nothing is more important than clarifying our ideals and purposes. We must see unquestionably what we hold as core values. Our purposes and motives must be carefully chosen. Otherwise, powerful forces from the media and mass culture easily hypnotize us into settling for less than our best. It's truly an act of will to choose and commit to an ideal with positive vision about the world's possibilities. Second is purifying and attuning our physical bodies. The birth of a new planetary culture will happen at this physical dimension. And how can we be participants, even helpers, in its birth unless we have healthy bodies with which to be involved? The stresses of changing times hit the body hard through nutrition and exercise. We must diligently work to do the best we can with our own physical bodies. A third crucial discipline is meditation, the daily practice of inner and outer peace. As we'll see, it's deeply linked to our values and ideals. What's more, meditation is a powerful tool for creating health for our physical bodies. Let's look at each of these three in sequence: setting values and ideals, attuning the physical body, and meditating. Discipline number 1, setting ideals and core values. The power of intentions and values is the indispensable to our creative response to inner earth changes. The exercise of self-evaluation and the set of ideals is something Case encouraged people to do on a regular basis. Many people find that a yearly discipline of reviewing core values works best. Perhaps around New Year's Day or near one's own birthday, setting ideals is a matter of carefully formulating the motives and intentions that you want to have, guiding and directing your life. We can designate ideals that are spiritual, mental, or physical. What did Case mean by the phrase spiritual ideal? It's not so much a goal or accomplishment that we hope to achieve, but instead refers to the purpose behind our actions or the spirit in which we approach the challenges and opportunities of life. This is the question to ask yourself in setting a spiritual ideal. What spirit of living do I want directing every part of my life? In other words, ask yourself what sense of meaning and purpose you want to strive for in the way you live. What's the core value or quality you wish to have guiding your life? Of course, not every action, thought, or feeling will reflect that ideal, because in our humanness, we often fall short. But each of us can aspire to a profound sense of meaning, a higher way of seeing life and others and self, As you determine your spiritual ideal, be sure it comes from deep within yourself and not from the expectations of others. In other words, the spiritual ideal for your life must not have a quality of ought or should. Throughout our lives, our parents, teachers, and authority figures tell us what our purposes and aspirations in life ought to be. A true spiritual ideal comes more authentically from our own self. How can this deeper, more genuine level be tapped? One way is to draw upon the peak spiritual moments you have already had in your life. Each of us has caught glimpses, however briefly, of a higher spiritual reality. Each of us has tasted a deeper, more profound sense of purposefulness to life than the perspective offered by a conscious physical life. What were the peak spiritual moments of your past? They may have been one or two special dreams in which you seemed to be touched by a higher reality. They may have been deep prayer and meditation experiences. Your peak spiritual moments may even have been in waking life, a loving moment with someone, a day of heightened creativity, or a special time out in nature. Think back over your life and recall several such special times. They are moments to be honored deeply and remembered. Even though the busyness of daily lives causes you to forget or ignore the impact they once had upon you, to choose a spiritual ideal, then take several minutes to sit quietly and remember these peak spiritual moments. Try to relive them and let these memories shape your thinking and feeling so that for a moment you become the person you were in those special experiences. Once you are in touch with that different place within yourself, allowing into your mind a word or phrase that describes that state of consciousness. For one person, the spiritual ideal might be loving freedom, or another person, it might be oneness with the light, and for still a third, simply service. No matter what words you use, they should describe a place of consciousness within yourself that you have actually touched and tasted. A spiritual ideal must be something living for you, not merely a philosophical abstraction. In setting a spiritual ideal this way, you may sense that even higher ideals are possible. In fact, one spiritual ideal is, in effect, a statement that affirms, "This is the highest meaning and purpose of life that I know as reality, because I have personally been touched by it." A spiritual ideal, as it has just been described, relates to our highest aspirations. Clearly, in the case of philosophy, of how to deal with inner earth changes, having high aspirations is crucial. But just as important is another ingredient, trust. Think about how you might aspire to something, but not trust that it is alive within you. Not trust that it is possible to experience for yourself. Without investing yourself through trust, you have genuinely set a spiritual ideal. This may not be a point of view that's easy to swallow, simply because most of us find trusting to be very difficult. To trust requires a more challenging use of free will than does aspiration alone. Trust means a willingness to surrender and let go of fears and doubts. It means to place ultimate belief in forces beyond your personal conscious self. You haven't yet set a spiritual ideal until you let go and put your trust in it. Here is a somewhat superficial example that will remind you of what it feels like to trust. When you turn on a light, you trust that the electricity will be there, ready to light up the room. When you turn the handle on the faucet, you trust that the water will start flowing. In other words, you probably spend little of your day worrying about the availability of power and water. Now, of course, a critic could say that you're taking it for granted, that many people in the world don't have immediate access to these resources. But the point here is not the fact that we are very fortunate. Instead, these examples teach us something about trust. When you trust, it brings the freedom to act without the burden of worry or doubt. The authentic ideal you hold is the one you don't have to spend time thinking about or questioning. It has become so much a part of your life that it's a given. When you meet a difficulty or challenge, you know you can count on the inspiration and power of that ideal just as surely as you can count on electricity and water when you need them. Some days your genuine ideal has the quality of being almost invisible to you because it's so deeply a part of how you look at the world. It's so essential that you don't stop to question it or worry about it. Once we have carefully set a personal spiritual ideal, choosing a word or a phrase that has deep, evocative power for us, then it is helpful to make that spiritual ideal a little closer to home. By selecting companion mental ideals and physical ideals, they are the more pragmatic steps for how we'll put that spiritual ideal into application. Actually, writing them down is a good idea because it forces us to be specific. Mental ideals are designated attitudes and feelings which we hope to keep in mind as often as possible, that we know will be stepping stones toward a fuller expression of our spiritual ideal. In the midst of a difficult relationship, one might choose tolerance as a mental ideal because an attitude that accepts the other person's point of view without judgment may be the first step toward the spiritual ideal that has been set. In a similar way, our actions and behaviors can be stepping stones. These optimal ways of behaving in the world are what Case called physical ideals. In the midst of that same difficult relationship, one might commit to a daily morning prayer for the other person because this would be a stepping stone toward tolerance and toward the spiritual ideal chosen. Of course, there's room for change, and we're likely to amend our list of mental ideals and physical ideals on a regular basis as a response to the variety of difficult people who come into our lives or to the challenging new problems that arise. For example, here's what one 45-year-old man identified as his ideals in the midst of a chaotic world, revisiting 5 of his own peak spiritual experiences, 2 special dreams, a potent meditation experience, and 2 extraordinary moments in nature. He arrived at the phrase centered peace. For a spiritual ideal, when it came to setting mental and physical ideas, he focused on 2 challenging parts of his life. First was a difficult relationship at work, a man whose behavior was constantly a source of annoyance. Although peace-centeredness seemed like a stretch for him in that relationship, he picked tolerance as a mental ideal. That is a stepping stone toward his spiritual ideal. As a physical ideal, he made a commitment to prayer for that man each day. For a second area of challenge, he selected his relationship with his own body, which often seemed to be restless and unhealthy, anything but peacefully centered. As a step toward that spiritual ideal, he identified appreciation as a mental ideal. Simply the attitude of being grateful for his body seemed like it would be a constructive steps. For a physical ideal, he decided that a couple of lifestyle changes would be a positive move, trying to get to bed by 10:30 at least 6 nights a week, and making sure that he drank at least 6 glasses of water a day. As he made progress with these mental and physical ideals, this man could expect to stretch himself a little more with mental and physical ideals that would take him closer to his spiritual ideal, both in those 2 parts of his life and in additional challenging situations. Even when we've set high ideals, often we never get around to doing much about them. Too easily we get distracted or pulled off onto detours. In fact, inner earth changes often create enormous distractions that try to siphon off our spiritual vitality. It would be well for most of us to examine our lives closely and see how we may use distractions to avoid putting energy into drawing near to our ideals. The effect of most distractions is to put our lives on hold. They are ways of tuning out most of the world and retreating to an awareness that does not challenge us at the growth points of our souls. And certainly our society offers many opportunities for this. Some of the ways are overt, such as drugs, whether we mean tranquilizers, alcohol, cocaine, marijuana, or whatever. It isn't hard to see that these sort of things can put barriers between ourselves and God by disengaging us from the mature ways that we can experience soul growth. But modern society offers lots of other consciousness-dulling distractions too. In the book Brave New World, Aldous Huxley presents a rather dim view of what the future might hold. Perhaps no book other than George Orwell's 1984 has had such a sobering effect on those of us who are taking a serious look at where the future may be leading us. In Huxley's literary imagination, people routinely use a drug called soma, which puts them in a stupor or transports them to a soothing fantasy. What is the soma of our times? We might observe some scary parallels between the effects of soma in Brave New World and television in our world. Both allow people to unplug their minds from what is actually before them. Both can easily become avoidance mechanisms. We might consider the degree to which television watching has become for each of us a daily habit that has begun to interfere with our relationship with God. It isn't so much the content of what we watch, although that can be significant for various reasons too, but that the process of disengaging our minds from the reality of our personal lives is a distraction which for some people stands directly in the way of spiritual growth. Another kind of distraction for some people is sports. Even participatory sports with their exercise and health benefits become a spiritual problem if taken to an extreme. But the larger problem is spectator sports, in which people are drugged into believing that the games being enacted before them are somehow more important than anything else in their lives. Somehow men are particularly vulnerable to this kind of psychology. Ask someone who has succumbed to this type of distraction, and he will say that his wife, children, home, and job are much more important to him than his favorite football team. But watch his emotions and his behavior. Sometimes you might not be sure what his priorities really are. No matter what you have placed between yourself and God, it's to your advantage to discover it. Without such self-discovery, it's very hard to stay focused on your real priorities and ideals. In times of inner change, these distractions will be points at which pressure is put on your life to grow and change. Discipline number 2, ideal-centered meditation. Meditation is a second practical key to creative living in the midst of inner earth changes. In Case's philosophy, meditation doesn't mean blanking out the mind or engaging in pleasant fantasy. Meditation is a word reserved for a very purposeful, specific spiritual discipline. That discipline involves a focused effort to experience deeply the reality and power of one's own spiritual ideal. Many books have been written about ideal-centered meditation. Based on Case's philosophy and the meditation principles of like-minded teachers, the practice is simple and easy to learn. Meditation differs from prayers in that meditation involves quieting the conscious mind and being alert for inspiration and renewal. In contrast, prayer is a purposeful activity of the conscious mind. In Case's approach to meditation, one selects a short statement of the spiritual ideal, what he calls an affirmation, and uses those few words to move into a closer and deeper experience of the reality and vitality of this core value. The words you choose should have a powerful evocative quality. They need to be able to awaken strong feelings for the spiritual ideal. Consider one example of an affirmation. If you had chosen love as your spiritual ideal, an appropriate affirmation for meditation might be something such as, "Let me always be a channel of blessings and love to others." The affirmation becomes a focal point of attention during the silence of meditation. What Case refers to as an affirmation is very similar to what is called a mantra or mind tool. In certain Eastern meditation systems, what words should you choose for your affirmation other than writing your own? You might take a favorite line from the Bible, e.g., "Be still and know that I am God," or from other sacred scripture. Some meditators keep their affirmations quite brief, and in fact use only the short phrase they have selected for their spiritual ideal. Most people find that between 10 and 20 minutes of quiet, uninterrupted time is required for each meditation session. What's more, regularity, preferably on a daily basis at about the same time, works best. Sitting comfortably, you can do whatever helps to get into a centered, purposeful frame of mind, listening to soothing or inspiring music for a few minutes, reading from sacred literature, or taking a few moments for prayer, either aloud or silent. You may find it helpful at the beginning of your meditation session to create in your mind some visual imagery that relates to your affirmation and helps you get in touch with it. For example, some meditators find it helpful to imagine themselves sitting in a special spiritual place. The image of that setting then allows them to identify more quickly with the life purpose that the affirmation represents. As you center your mind and move into the quiet of meditation, focus your attention on the words of the affirmation and any images you're using. Do this until you begin to experience the feeling and spirit behind the words. You are using your conscious will to concentrate and keep your attention one-pointed. However, the effort you make to direct attention is not an intellectual effort to dissect the affirmation or analyze the images. Instead, let your attention rest upon the feeling and spirit the affirmation begins to call forth from your unconscious mind. This stage may require much practice because of the strong tendency for your attention to drift off to distracting thoughts and emotions. Once you have reached a point where you recognize that the affirmation has begun to do its work, that new feelings are being awakened, then drop the words and any images you have created. This is the silence of meditation. Here you rest in a silent attention in the quiet spirit of the ideal your affirmation represents. At this point, words are unnecessary. They have done their job by getting you back in touch with another way of feeling and seeing yourself and life. When your attention drifts, repeat the steps of focusing attention on the words and then let go of them. Once you have their spirit, in other words, you can expect that your capacity to stay in the silence will be limited. At first, you will probably find that after just 10 or 15 seconds of silently holding the feeling of your affirmation, a distracting thought or emotion will grab your attention and pull you away. When you recognize you have been caught up in a distraction, go back to refocusing on the affirmation until you re-experience its meaning and spirit. You may have to repeat this sequence many times in a single meditation session. Even experienced meditators have to go back frequently and reawaken to their sense of highest purpose by recalling the affirmation and then reattaining the silence. As a final step, surrender all efforts to make something happen. All the previous steps have included effort on your part to direct the meditation session. If you have no expectation or desires for some special experience in meditation, conscious effort and exercise of will has been necessary. However, the last phase of your meditations should include a short period during which you fully surrender, discontinuing all conscious effort when you have spent sufficient time holding in silent attention the feeling and meaning of your affirmation, and you feel permeated by its spirit. Release even the affirmation. A good way to experience the surrender is to refocus your attention on your breathing. In other words, once you have let the meaning of your affirmation permeate both your conscious and unconscious, then spending several minutes in attentive breathing. This exercise at the close is not to force a change in consciousness by an extraordinary breathing technique, instead by letting your attention focus on something that, as simple as your breath, the power of what you have subconsciously achieved in the previous steps is able to touch you even more deeply. The key to this final step is the word surrender. There must be a sense of giving up, but not giving in, letting go of all mental efforts to force something to happen. Discipline number 3, right diet and nutrition. What we feed our bodies has a tremendous effect on our state of consciousness. Diet and nutrition is bound to be a key variable in our capacity to meet inner earth changes in a creative and hopeful way. If we chemically undermine the health of our bodies, we're sure to find the going very tough in these times of radical change. But if we give the cells of our bodies a balanced and vital source of energy, it will allow the best within us to emerge. Case's readings spoke very often about diet and nutrition. In fact, 2/3 of his psychic material concerned health and healing, and the vast majority of his health readings include dietary suggestions for the recipient. At the time he offered his philosophy of nutrition, consciousness, and healing, it was considered revolutionary. But in the decades that have now passed, the best of nutritional science has started to sound more and more like Case's suggestions. 2 fundamental elements make up Case's diet recommendations: balance and food sources. Balance relates to the relative percentage of one's diet that comes from food that metabolizes to produce an acidic residue in the body. Such acid-reacting foods should make up 20% of one's diet, the remaining 80% being foods that metabolize to create an alkaline residue. These 2 lists provide the general guidelines. Acid-reacting foods: meats, animal fats, and vegetable oils, large prunes, plums, cranberries, and rhubarb. All cereal grains and their products such as bread, breakfast foods, rolled oats, polished rice, etc. Brown rice is somewhat less acid-forming. All high-starch and protein foods, white sugar, syrups, nuts, peanuts, and coconut, legumes, dried beans, dried peas, and lentils. Alkaline reacting foods. All fruits fresh and dried, except large prunes, plums, and cranberries. All vegetables fresh and dehydrated, except legumes. All forms of milk, including buttermilk, clabber, sour milk, cottage cheese, and cheese. Another aspect of nutritional balance concerns food combinations. It is not enough to work simply with the list of acid and alkaline reacting foods. One also has to be careful about combining certain foods in the same meal. Case's most frequent recommendations about combinations to avoid were 1. Milk or cream in coffee. 2. Citrus fruits, including orange juice and whole grains. 3. Milk and orange juice. 4. Starches and proteins. Food sources is the second fundamental element of Case's diet, principles which can help us stay focused and healthy in stressful, changing times. Case often referred to the body as the temple. If you were literally building a sacred temple, you'd be very careful about the quality of the stones and other materials that went into that special structure. Just as surely, each of us ought to be vigilant concerning the quality of what goes into our mouths. One important aspect to consider is purity. In an age of agribusiness and widespread use of potent pesticides, we may have to work hard to achieve the ideal purity we'd like to have for our diet. And even if 100% pure, organically grown food seems to be an unreasonable stretch, one can still strive for a certain target percentage that has a high purity standard. And don't forget, pure water, 6 to 8 glasses per day. By food sources, Case also meant the locale from which it comes. He encouraged us to try to find local sources of food, suggesting that food grown near our town or city might vibrationally be easier to assimilate. Another advantage of locally grown, or better yet, homegrown fruits and vegetables is that of vitamin retention. Case pointed out how certain foods lose a considerable portion of their nutritional value in the days following harvesting, and often food grown locally is available to us much closer to the date on which it was harvested. For this reason, plus the wonderful effects that come from getting one's own hands in the soil, having a small garden at home is highly desirable. Along with the other two disciplines of ideals and meditation, careful attention to the nutrition can make an extraordinary difference in one's life. These three methods, advocated time and time again, Case, can allow us to have the clarity, vitality, and strength to meet the stresses and uncertainty of these times. All three of these disciplines take practice and patience with oneself. For some individuals, they probably need to be phased in gradually, but with consistency of practice, these three methods will produce powerful results and allow us to fully participate in building the most creative possibilities for the new millennium. Case's errors and the flexibility of the future. How realistic is it to expect that as individuals can significantly shape the future, disciplines such as setting ideals, attuning our bodies, and meditation can be expected to help us personally. But will they actually help create the course of history in the decades just ahead? Some say no. They assume that the future is already fixed and predetermined. Prophets such as Case can see that future, they claim, and there's not much we can do but prepare for it. That's not the position that Case himself took in his readings about the future. Conditions for the 21st century and beyond aren't predetermined. Yes, there may be strong trends and likelihoods. Even the overall shape of things may be largely set, just as a human embryo already has the patterns that will create its appearance at birth. But there is still room to influence that development. Ironically, it's instances in which Case's predictions seem to have been wrong that should give us a measure of hope that we can still make a difference. He was not 100% accurate in his prophecies, though examples suggest that perhaps the future is continually being shaped and that our own modest efforts have a role to play as the new millennium begins to emerge. When we look at the Case prophecies with a critical eye, it's clear that some of the predictions have failed to come true, at least within the timetable Case envisioned. Those failures could potentially undermine our trust in his reliability. However, other influences may also contribute to the errors too. Those additional factors conceivably relate to our own powers to help shape the future, powers that come through our attitudes and actions. One essential principle stands out in the Case's statement about how we can still influence what's to come. Our responses to the inner millennium shift significantly affect the way in which the outer changes play out. Case's descendants and the serious students of his works haven't tried to hide his errors. There is no argument about the fact that the Case readings were fallible. Hugh Lynn Case and Edgar Evans Case have written a book documenting some of the cases in which their father was wrong, entitled The Outer Limits of Edgar Case's Power. It has sold fewer copies than almost any other nationally distributed book on his psychic work, perhaps because people generally do not want to hear about a psychic's error. Yet we cannot avoid this issue in a study of the Earth Changes prophecies. We must each consider what it is about this man's work that gives us reason to consider seriously his warnings. In fact, there are probably only two reasons for us to treat the Earth Changes readings with curiosity and respect. First is the remarkable convergence of Case's prophecies with those from other cultures and time periods, predictions of which Case had no conscious knowledge. Many of them were outlined in Chapter 6. Corroborative evidence is one of the reliable tools used by scientists and researchers in many academic disciplines. In this case, the parallels strongly suggest that we take Case's Millennium Prophecies seriously. Second is the almost undeniable evidence that Case was a gifted psychic. His accuracy in diagnosing physical ailments was astounding. There is a remarkable frequency of dramatic health improvements in people who followed the individualized recommendations they had received in their readings. The sheer volume of accurate physical readings is a persuasive reason to take seriously the statements he made in readings outside the scope of healthcare. Of course, positive research findings about his medical clairvoyant powers do not prove anything about his views of history. His dream interpretations or prophecies of earth changes, to a large measure, each of the areas in which Case gave readings needs to stand on its own for testing. By analogy, just because your general practitioner gave you good advice for healing a sprained ankle, would you automatically trust him or her for brain surgery? Of course not, because physicians typically have areas of specialty. There might be some excellent brain surgeons who also have a general practice, but we cannot assume that is always the case. So let's briefly consider instances in which specific case predictions failed to materialize. Most of the prophecies do not have specific dates associated with them. For this reason, it is usually difficult to judge whether or not they are correct. If a psychic says someday Los Angeles will be destroyed by an earthquake, it can never be proved wrong. If that psychic says that between 1958 and 1998 we can expect to see Los Angeles destroyed, then at least we will be able to evaluate the information by 1998. There were a few cases, however, in which Case gave specific dates for major changes to happen. As we've already seen, events for 1936 is a good case in point, because several things Case predicted failed to occur. In another instance regarding the rising of the hypothetical lost continent of Atlantis, Case referred in 1940 to a specific dates in the future. And Poseidia will be among the first portions of Atlantis to rise again, expected in 68 and 69, and not so far away. There is currently no clear evidence to suggest that this prophecy was fulfilled. Some investigators feel that they found underwater, in the late 1960s, evidence of the ruins of a civilization near Brimini. This claim is still arguable, and the fact remains that Case predicted the rising of land in 1968 and 1969, something which seems fairly certain not to have happened. All of these instances in which Case prophecies appear to be wrong may be interpreted and analyzed from a variety of perspectives. In fact, there are alternatives, at least 3 ways in which we can approach the problem created by the mistaken readings just cited. More than just an intellectual exercise, a careful look at these alternatives addresses the key theme for this chapter. Is the immediate future something that can still be influenced or changed, and if so, how? First, let's consider the nature of time and the possibility that Case's error were primarily a misperception of timing. Many theorists who speculate about higher dimensional reality feel that time, as we understand it, is probably a quality of only this 3-dimensional physical world. Perhaps Case was in a place of higher dimensional consciousness, where likely events in a physical space appeared accurately to his perception, and yet their location in time was clouded or ambiguous. This would suggest that even the events that were predicted and did not happen may yet come to pass. However, other approaches have also been proposed in order to explain the apparent errors. A second possibility is that many of these prophecies are symbolic in nature. In other words, Could it be that in 1926 California and Japan did experience jolting changes, if not geological, then perhaps economic, social, or political? Could it be that 1936 was a year in which the poles did shift? Not the literal rotation of the earth, but the spiritual, economic, or political equilibrium of the world. Did Atlantean consciousness rise to the surface in 1968 and 1969? These were particularly turbulent years of social unrest in Western society, and a case might be made that a certain frame of mind symbolized by the mythic image of Atlantis determined not to let the world go down a pathway of self-destruction. The symbolism explanation is attractive because it challenges us to look at the case prophecies in a broader scope, to identify the themes and patterns in his statements, finding the teaching quality of his message, much as we would from a parable of Jesus or one of Aesop's fables. It requires us to recognize a big picture in what Case's inner source was trying to convey, even if the man Edgar Case fell short of being able to articulate it accurately. Perhaps land rising in the Bahamas in 1968 or 1969 was the best that Case could do to convey the visionary images that came from his superconscious mind. He wasn't a perfect channel of his inspiration. By his own admission, and when words and dates had to be found, perhaps he sometimes came up short. It's easy to see why a visionary like Nostradamus may have preferred to make his predictions in poetic terms that maintained a good measure of the ambiguity that presumably accompanies the mystic's view of the mundane world. How then are we to judge the wisdom of a seer? Something invaluable is sure to be missed if all we can do is judge by reductionism. What happens if our evaluation of Case's statements about 1926, 1936, or 1968 to 69 are reduced solely to questions such as, did the Earth's literal axis of rotation alter in 1936? Or did a dry land with 12,000-year-old architectural ruins surface in 1968 from the water of the Bahamas? The purely physical answers here are no, but we should be more sophisticated seekers of meaning and wisdom. By considering the symbolic themes that Case used, we may find insignificant insight and truth, even in the predictive statements that some critics have dismissed as obvious errors. However, in spite of how attractive this symbolic interpretation may be, it has its dangers. It's tempting to misuse it and come out treating Case as a cult figure, someone who could never be wrong. Case himself knew better and never wanted such treatment. He realized that his readings were sometimes distorted or contaminated with false impressions in the back of our own minds, even as we give serious consideration to a symbolic interpretation of some Millennium Prophecy readings. We need to remember that possibility for error. We are left, then, with at least one other approach, perhaps the most insightful and promising one. This point of view suggests that something happened between many of Case's predictions and the date on which they were to have taken place. For example, most of the predictions about 1936 were made in the period from 1932 to 1934. Could it be that between 1934 and 1936, changes took place that altered the previewed course of events? This approach presupposes a notion of prophecy that is probably very sound, that the future is not fixed and predictions can only be statements of likelihood or probabilities. The course of events is like a train rushing down the tracks, with various forks in the tracks representing alternatives. At each fork, the switch has been set in one position or another. Unless someone changes the switch, that train will follow a foreseeable path. The Case readings themselves present this picture of prophecy. There is repeated reference to the way in which the actions and attitudes of humanity will shape the course of the future. The exact mechanism by which we could have such an effect is still somewhat of a mystery, but later in this chapter we'll examine one theory about how the thoughts and actions of even a relatively small percentage of humanity could alter the decision-making process of world leaders to enhance the prospects for peace. We'll also consider a way in which the thoughts of humanity may even influence the forces of nature. For the moment, perhaps a basic principle from the Case philosophy is sufficient. The universe is an interrelated whole, and part of this connected universe is the unseen realm of thought energy. In other words, what we experience as physical reality is primarily a result of what has been collectively built by humanity at the level of thought or consciousness. But how, then, could the readings have occasionally been wrong? If Case's psychic gift allowed him to see clearly into this causative realm of thought energy, how could he have been mistaken about 1926, 1936, and 1968 to 69? One theory to explain the errors is that new thoughts are continually being created. If sufficient numbers of people change their consciousness after a prophecy has been given, then they might redirect the flow of events which materialize in the physical world. This is certainly the biblical notion of prophecy. The Old Testament spokesman of God always had the same message: change your ways, or else a destruction or calamity will befall you. In the story of the prophet Jonah, the people of Nineveh did alter their ways, and the catastrophe was averted. It's to the credit of the case readings that in at least one case they detected the changing course of events. We have seen the rather dramatic way in which Case's detailed prophecies concerning 1936 proved to be wrong. However, in January of 1936, at least one reading showed that Case had a new view of what was to take place that year. He specifically stated that the tremendous earthquake previously forecast for San Francisco would not happen that year. Unfortunately, he provided no explanation as to why the prophecy had changed. Case had a dynamic, changeable vision of prophecy, whereas in 1933, Case predicted an earthquake in San Francisco of unprecedented proportions. By January of 1936, he correctly saw that this was not going to happen. We are left to wonder if he simply had blurred psychic vision in 1933, which got clearer as the target date approached, or if some changes in the consciousness of people began to steer world events in a new direction. The latter of these two alternatives is much more challenging and exciting. It makes us participants in these times of transition. The notion of participating in the building process of a new millennium is crucial. If we must sit back and wait for things to happen to us, then these times of change become all the more frightening. But with a sense of our own creative powers, the difficulties can be met with hope. We have a responsibility for our history will unfold. This is not only for questions on international warfare, population, and distribution of food resources, but even for the geological and geographical changes that may or may not come to pass. It's vital that we accept this sense of responsibility, and for this very reason, it's the third alternative that we should pursue most intently. This one that asserts that prophecies sometimes fail because human choices have set another form of the future in motion. It says that the creative potential of human consciousness is more powerful than the psychic power of the prophet. It shifts the focus away from anxieties about proving Case's psychic gift and toward the responsibilities we all have in shaping the future. The third alternative is the one that deserves our attention because it puts the ultimate responsibility on us. It is actually the beginning of a much needed redefinition of psychic. It says that the professional psychic isn't the only one who can tune in to likely future events. The psychic realm is the level on which all of us are operating as we actively create the future together. We can make a difference. Case's most important Millennium Prophecy unequivocally asserts that we can make a difference as humanity collectively creates its future. That's why this book has directed so much attention to the inner millennium shift. As we find creative ways to meet these personal changes, we help to build a more balanced, harmonious way for the outer millennium shift to unfold. Case had a down-home way of making this point. The little leaven can leaven the whole lump. It's a powerful principle. A few spiritually attuned souls can lift the consciousness of all humanity. This philosophy has been called the principle of critical mass. We're likely to have heard this term in a much more gruesome context, the explosion of an atomic bomb. To build a fission weapon, physicists know that it requires a threshold amount of certain radioactive substances, such as one form of uranium. If we have less than that threshold amount, no explosion can happen. But once we reach the threshold point, that is, the critical mass, something can suddenly start to happen. The process is illustrated in the graph on the next page. The broken line represents our common thinking, which says, the effect I get out is in direct proportion to the amount I put in. In fact, many aspects of life follow this kind of relationship. However, in contrast, the solid line represents a process controlled by the principle of critical mass. If we look carefully, we'll see that the other essential aspects of life follow this alternative rule. Let's consider examples for each of the two. Some people find that the amount of food they eat has an effect on their weight, which roughly follows the broken line, or the number of dollars you pay per month in rent may be directly proportional to the quality of dwelling in which you live, or the amount of time you spend studying for a test will have a direct proportional effect on your test score. Of course, a more accurate depiction of many life experiences would be a curve approximating the broken line. The line would rise proportionally at first, but the concept of diminishing returns would set in, and the line would begin to curve and then flatten out. But let's pause at the example of studying for a test. Suppose you are stuck in your learning by not understanding a particularly key concept. If you study 1 or 2 hours, it may look pretty hopeless for the test tomorrow. Your score will be low, and furthermore, the difference will be very slight between having studied for 1 hour versus 2 hours. But imagine that it takes 3 hours to crack the difficult concept. Suddenly, at the 3-hour point, that elusive concept becomes clear, and now you have the insight to be able to solve what had seemed to be impossible problems. Your score now is likely to be very high. Additionally, study beyond that may help a little bit more, but not very significantly. To put this into a chart, we have 1 hour of study, the effect, 45 test score. 2 hours of study, effect, 47 test score. 3 hours of study, the effect, 85 test score. 4 hours of study, 87 test score. This is a classic example of critical mass, or the threshold effect. Here's another commonplace example: running water into a bathtub that has no overflow protection drain, and then measuring the amount of water that has spilled out onto the bathroom floor. For the first 5 minutes in which the faucet runs, there is no spilling effect upon the floor. But suddenly the critical point is reached. In this case, the 75-gallon capacity of the bathtub. In Case's estimation, the future of planetary consciousness will be shaped by a critical mass type of curve, and significantly, he never suggests that the future of the world will be shaped by a majority vote. It will not take 51% of humanity in order to create a dramatic change in planetary awareness. The critical mass effect can be initiated by a relatively small number of people. That little leaven, which can lift consciousness in all humanity, may just a handful of people compared to the Earth's population. The teachings of the Bible, as well as the philosophy of the case readings, indicate that this has happened before. Recall the story of Abraham at the time just before the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. God warns Abraham that this destruction will take place because of the selfishness of people in those cities. What is Abraham's response? He attempts to bargain with God. He wonders, if 50 righteous people can be found, would the cities be saved? God's response is yes. That for the sake of the 50, the city will not be destroyed. And then Abraham proceeds to find out just how far God will go in his offer of mercy. 45, 40, 30, 20, 10. Yes, God says, even only 10 righteous people can be found. The principle of critical mass will produce a saving effect on the entire populace of the cities. 10 was the threshold amount. Unfortunately, it appears from the story that even those few could not be located. In another illustration, the case readings speak of the ancient Jewish sect called the Essenes as having served as a critical mass. Historians tell us little about this group of people who lived before and during the time of Jesus. Much more is known about the larger sects of Jewish thought in those times. The Sadducees and the Pharisees, in fact, were it not for the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls near the ruins of Essene community at Qumran, almost nothing would be known of them. However, in Case's psychic vision of the past, the Essenes played a key role in the coming of the Christ. It was this group who prepared themselves as a channel for the Messiah's entrance. Over many decades of practicing physical, mental, and spiritual purification, they became a leaven that acted upon the consciousness of the planet. According to the case readings, it was largely through the work of this relatively small group, both Mary and Joseph among them, that the Christ incarnated as Jesus. Apparently there were problems later. Jesus was not exactly the sort of savior they had planned for, and there may have been a break between Jesus and this community as he reached adulthood. However, in Case's visionary view of history, the fact remains that a threshold number of people, far, far smaller than any numerical majority, had an impact that was profoundly far-reaching, and what we might ask are the numbers we are working with as we consider the possibility of critical mass changes. In our own times, perhaps the quantity will be similar to those of the past. How many Essenes did it require to create a channel for divine incarnation? Perhaps just several hundred. In biblical times, we have seen that just 10 righteous people were all that was required for a divine promise of mercy. Two passages from the case's Millennium Prophecy, both given in June 1940, mention specific numbers as threshold amounts for a quickening effect on the mass consciousness. When Case addressed the issue of why there was so much turmoil in the 20th century world, he said that it was because people had forgotten God. It was not something that had to be, nor was it the karmic destiny of any nation or the planet as a whole. Then he went on to assert that the prayers of a single individual can save a city. In a second prophecy given in that same reading, he promised a group of 64 people that they had the spiritual power to alter the course of America's destiny as World War II drew near for our nation. For the prayer and the living of same by those 60 and 4 who are here gathered may even save America from being invaded, if that is what ye desire. The first prophecy suggests that the threshold level for changing the future of a community or city is not even 10 people, as the Old Testament story tells it. Instead, perhaps it is just one person who is attuned to God's will. The second passage is even more provocative. It was directly, specifically to the 64 people gathered to hear a public reading by Case. This passage suggests a way of influencing the collective future of an entire nation. In this case, it was the threat that American territory would be invaded. We should note that World War II was already underway in Europe and the Far East, yet it was still a year and a half before the United States would be drawn in. Case's prophecy here in June of 1940 makes a bold assertion. If even 64 people pray and live in attunement with God's plan, then the likely future for the American people and invasion could be changed. Apparently, the critical mass in consciousness was not achieved because the nation soon found its territory being invaded by aerial attack and Pearl Harbor less than 2 years later. What's fascinating about this story is the report of one person who was present that day and recalls the discussion among the group members when the reading ended. Instead of questions like, what kind of prayer will be the right one, or at what time of day could we all be committed to praying, the group members have wondered aloud, where do you think the attack will come? Fear had crept in and overshadowed the hopeful promise in Case's prophetic statement. Looking back more than 40 years later, we may think of those people as having been foolish or fear-ridden. We wonder how they could have missed the spirit of what was being promised, how they could have failed to see and grasp the spiritual opportunity being offered them. And yet, don't we often do the same thing now? The principles and numbers are still the same. The situation may be a bit different. World War II has come and gone, but today there are equally threatening prospects for our world. But once again, 64 people might be enough to make the difference for a nation the size of America. So what is our response? Do we wonder where the first earthquake will hit? Do we speculate on what kinds of riots will ensue if there is economic collapse? The opportunity is still there to be the little leaven that quickens the consciousness of the masses. This is a powerful concept which says that a small group of dedicated people can have a tremendous effect on the course of the future. It is an idea that bestows on us a sense of promise and a challenge of responsibility, and we are more likely to feel some hope and accept that responsibility if we see clearly just how the magic of critical mass works in the realm of human awareness. A mechanism to explain critical mass. How is it that 10 righteous people or the prayers of just one individual could save a city? What forces and laws are at work to create such an extraordinary thing? Is it that God is placed in a dilemma? Perhaps in looking down on Sodom and seeing 10 righteous people, God would feel stuck. He would not afford to destroy his best followers. This line of reasoning would say so. He would be forced to let everyone else off the hook. However attractive this kind of argument may be, it has little merit. It reduces God to a befuddled being who dishes out punishment and yet is easily manipulated and cornered. We can do far better than this lame and naive explanation of how the principle of critical mass works on human consciousness. We can identify the universal laws that are at work and that naturally govern this process. Let's begin with the Universal Law of Oneness, which Case proposed as the most fundamental principle in the universe. In fact, one Case reading says that the law of oneness is so fundamental to the way the cosmos runs that it should be the object of study for the first 6 months of spiritual inquiry. We might wonder how we could ever study that law for so long. It seems as if we could merely agree that all force or energy is essentially just an expression of the one life force. Then we could move on to more interesting topics. However, there is much more than this to the notion of oneness. There are many subtle ways in which it directs our experiences. For example, the law of oneness provides us with a clue about how a threshold number of people can change the course of the future for all humanity. It's a key to understanding a mechanism that may allow the love of a few people to lift the awareness of humanity. The law of oneness begins by asserting that there are not two equal but opposing powers of good and evil that are battling for dominion of human minds. There is light and there is darkness, yes. Our experience tells us this, and no abstract law of oneness can deny this experience which we all have. There are good works being done by some people, and there are evil appearing destructive works being done by others. The question, however, is this: what's the relationship between them, between light and darkness, or good and evil? Are they equal but opposing powers? If so, then we have a majority rule when they clash, and 9 units of good when confronted with 10 units of evil will always result in a victory for evil. But is that really what happens? When the light confronts darkness, what is the result of their interaction? For example, if someone lights a candle in a darkened auditorium, doesn't the light permeate the entire room? Admittedly, that candle may illuminate the huge room with only a very dim light, but the fact remains that the darkness does not overpower the tiny candle flame. Light and darkness are not really equal but opposing forces. Darkness is better understood as an absence of light. In other words, there is a fundamental oneness in the elements of this example. There is the one force which in its full manifestation is pure light. It's possible to experience diminished or dimmed expressions of that one force, or even the absence of its expression, but the darkness is not a power that is independent of the light and could defeat it by superior numbers. In the same fashion, the prayers of one person can work to save an entire community. The darkened consciousness of thousands of people do not constitute a power that can defeat a lighted prayer. Despite numerical superiority, of course, that one person who lives in a community of fear and selfishness may be psychologically affected by her surroundings. She may feel discouraged, drained, and stuck in the thinking patterns of her neighbors. She may forget to pray or may doubt the value of prayer. In this sense, the darkness can win. However, the law of oneness holds that once that person remembers to pray and believes that healing work is being done, then the darkened consciousness of the masses does not block the widespread impact. In addition to the law of oneness, a second universal law helps us to understand the mechanism of critical mass. It's a principle from physics, the law of resonance. Perhaps you recall from high school physics the way in which tuning forks can demonstrate this law at a physical level. What happens if you strike a tuning fork and set it to vibrating, and then move it near another fork of similar structure? It will set the second tuning fork to vibrating as well. Something similar happens at the level of human minds. It may well be that the vibration of consciousness can have a resonant effect upon other minds, recreating a sympathetic vibration or a state of awareness. Let's consider 2 ways in which the law of resonance may operate to explain the critical mass effect on human minds and behavior. First, consider an idea that Case and many others have suggested. Is it possible that there are many souls of advanced spiritual development who stand ready to help the earth in this time of transition? This aid may be through direct incarnation, if appropriate parents can be found, or it may be through the infusion of ideas and knowledge which could be telepathically transferred, perhaps even without the receiver being quite sure where that inspirational insight came from. These ideas might be philosophical insights into the human condition, or they might be technological inventions which could help humanity deal with threatened physical survival. The law of resonance gives us one way of understanding how this assistance would be received. If a certain number of people made themselves into a receptive tuning forks of the proper structure, then they might be set to vibrating with a consciousness awareness that is quite extraordinary. But if instead of philosophical and technological ideas being transferred to receptive channels, it was certain vibratory frequencies of energy itself, the reception and expression of such energies might be used to heal physical bodies, or even to heal and purify our polluted and sick physical earth. We can only guess what kind of people might be available from conscious beings in other dimensions of God's creation. Of course, we cannot passively await their intervention and expect them to clear up the mess we have collectively created. However, there may be significant validity to the law of resonance. It probably applies to a lot more than just physical objects like tuning forks. As we work to shape our personal structure by meditation, exercise, diet, etc., we may someday find ourselves set to vibrating with energies or ideas that seem to come from beyond ourselves and which promise to help the world as a whole. It could well be that within every person there are many tuning forks. Each one of these tuning forks symbolizes a distinct outlook on life or state of mind, and anyone who seriously studies himself is equipped to discover this inner diversity. According to Case's philosophy, one such tuning fork within each and every one of us is special. The extraordinary state of mind he called the universal Christ consciousness. Perhaps it has been buried away and forgotten in many people, but it's still there. However, it can be activated in one of two ways. The first is by conscious effort on the part of the individual, by seeking it out and making specific efforts to mobilize its vibration in physical life. It's probably safe to say that only a small percentage of the world's population is involved in diligently doing this now. The second way is by the law of resonance. If someone nearby has set his or her own Christ consciousness tuning fork to vibrating, it may create a sympathetic activity in similar structures in other people, just as surely as the experiment worked in high school physics class. And how would people experience such a secondary awakening of Christ consciousness vibrations? Since they are not voluntary at work on the spiritual path, how would they receive the new vibrations mysteriously emerging from within themselves? These vibrations might appear as unfamiliar, new feelings about themselves and others. They might come as dreams or intuitions. They could manifest as a change in physical health, for some as a healing and for others as a temporary illness. As the old ways of treating their bodies can no longer be handled by a newly sensitized body and mind, or they might appear as some sort of cosmic or supernatural physical phenomenon. In response to these inner events in man's consciousness, some people expect an outer physical reappearance of the Christ, a second coming, as the manner in which this global awakening would express itself. Whatever the means or the appearance, we can expect that some people will be inspired by it, because what spontaneously happens to them, they proceed consciously to begin work on nurturing this newly realized spiritual dimension of themselves. However, others may be more frightened or stubborn about the process, and they would reject what they feel happening to themselves. Here then is a scenario for how human consciousness will be transformed into the coming decades. It doesn't require the impact of outer earth changes, cataclysms such as earthquakes, wars, or weather changes. This interpretation of Case's most essential Millennium Prophecy is much less sensationalistic. It shows how relatively few people could work to bring on a new culture for a new millennium. The key ingredient will be a sufficient number of people dealing creatively with the stress of their own inner millennium shift. The scenario supposes that even a small group, perhaps only several thousand people, will begin to handle the inner changes in a loving, creative, responsible fashion. These people will not be sucked into the darkened consciousness of the masses, which is cynical and fearful. Instead, they will attune themselves. They will make themselves of such a structure that new energies and new ideas will set their minds and bodies to vibrating through the law of resonance. They will receive aid from the Christ consciousness within themselves and perhaps also from the spiritual beings in other dimensions. When the membership of this group reaches a certain number, then a critical mass point will have been reached, a threshold level will have been achieved, and a tremendous new effect will come into play. Now a second type of resonance will be set in motion throughout the planet, perhaps within a matter of months, although it could be years. Resonant vibrations will begin to stir to life the Christ consciousness. It will happen in people of all faith traditions, and each person will find words out of their own cultural context to describe it. Even those who haven't been seeking inwardly or spiritually will begin spontaneously to have transformative experiences. This will be a remarkable event in human history. It will be a moment when humanity is on the verge of a quantum leap in awareness. If that moment coincides with a period of catastrophic outer changes in the world, then the choices and responses will be even more crucial. But this scenario supposes that very large numbers of people will be inspired by the new ideas that they feel coming from within themselves. Remarkable dreams, intuitions, and feelings will come to millions, even many of those who haven't been consciously seeking them. Certainly there will be holdouts, individuals who may fearfully hold on to the old ways, but will have turned the corner, and the momentum will have become unstoppable. Humanity will be at the dawn of what Case and so many others have predicted for the 21st century and beyond, a new paradigm for human living based on cooperation and peace. the politics of the transition. It has been said that the politicians are the last to respond to changes in mass consciousness. The spirit of times is usually felt in art, science, and religion before it finds expression in the power games of the governing process. However, how then, we might wonder, will the transition to a new paradigm overcome the blocks created by world leaders who want to hang on to the old system? How can enlightened souls have an impact on the decisions being made which affect all nations? There is no point in claiming that by magic several thousand spiritually attuned people can cause world leaders to alter the quality and direction of their decisions. Instead of relying on magic for an explanation, let us consider by what mechanism spiritually attuned people can create what Case envisioned as an invisible empire. Speaking in 1927 of those who might dedicate their lives to an expression of the universal Christ spirit, Case called such individuals those that would build an invisible empire within the hearts of men. The term empire is a blatantly political one. It refers to power and influence in human affairs that extend beyond the borders of any one nation. Historically, we might think of the Roman Empire or the Persian Empire, clear examples of political influences that span many regions and nationalities, when the Case readings refer to spiritually attuned people creating an invisible empire. They suggest that we can influence the decision-making process that governs the nations, and invisible suggests that the influence will come at the levels of mind and spirit. But how can we really have an effect upon the decisions that shape the world, such as the choices of war and peace, or the decisions on how national resources will be spent? The answer lies in first considering who it is that is really in control of the world. Before you respond that it's the presidents of the United States and Russia, or the chairman of Exxon and ITT, think about this principle. Only those who can truly control themselves can claim to control things beyond themselves. That means control over one's body, attitudes, emotions, and actions, and the indisputable evidence is that most, if not all, of the so-called world leaders are actually controlled. This isn't a matter of some conspiracy in which multinational corporations secretly mold the decisions of governments. Instead, it's a matter of world leaders not being enlightened, spiritually free beings, and so they are controlled, but the influence comes from their own subconscious minds. Their desires, fears, insecurities, and habits shape the nature of their decisions, which in turn affect millions of people. Often those controlling influences from within themselves are hidden or only dimly perceived. Imagine, for example, how many important decisions are made by world leaders because of a feeling, mood, or hunch. Suppose a national leader had to decide the next morning whether or not to invade a neighboring country. Consider but one factor, the quality and content of his or her dreams that night, remembered or unremembered, will likely leave that world leader with a particular mood or perspective in the morning, which could have a large effect upon the decision. To the degree that world leaders are not yet enlightened beings who are free from the controlling influence of their own subconscious minds, we can exert a tremendous impact on their decisions. It is at the level of the subconscious minds that the apparent decision makers are directable. If Case is correct and all subconscious minds are in contact with another, then we have identified a vehicle for creating an invisible empire from a dimension beyond the three-dimensional physical world. Enlightened awareness has an influence. A world leader may never say, "I feel people praying for me and encouraging me to select the way of cooperation and peace." However, that may be exactly what is taking place. In the past, patterns of fear or confusion may have existed within the subconscious mind of that leader, which exerted a control and which led to choices of international tension and discord. But in the not-too-distant future, that same subconscious level may be the avenue by which the world leader is led to see matters a bit differently, or to have a new feelings and hunches about how to deal with old problems. We can make a difference in the shaping of world events. We can make the difference. Just look at the arithmetic that can be extrapolated from some of the Case prophecies. 64 people were once enough to change the destiny of the United States, a nation of 150 million people at the time. We could use the same ratios of influence applied to the modern world population of 5.5 billion. That would give us approximately 2,400 as a target number for the critical mass to change the destiny of humanity. Perhaps as few as just 2,400 people who truly live and pray in attunement with God's plan will be the threshold amount to trigger global changes for healing. If we will just understand the power to which we have access, this can occur. If we will but look deeply and see what power is really all about, then we can judge in those whose hands it actually lies. Yes, we can make the difference by the way that a few of us prepare for and deal with the inner aspect of the millennium changes. We will largely determine what form the outer millennium changes will take. Just a handful of spiritually dedicated people can create a graceful, loving form of change in which all humanity will participate. And that, at its core, is the fundamental millennium prophecy of Edgar Cayce.